Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by Fordham University historian Tyler Stovall, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, published just last month by Princeton University Press. Professor Stovall, congratulations and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. I'm really looking forward to your talk. We are also very fortunate to have with us Professor Alice Conklin of The Ohio State University, who will provide initial comments and begin this afternoon's discussion that we hope will involve many of you in the audience as well. A warm welcome to you, Professor Conklin, as well. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I have the privilege to co-chair this seminar series with my colleague, Professor Eric Arneson of George Washington University. Eric, who is an alum of the Wilson Center, we're proud to say, also serves as director of the National History Center and co-chairs in that capacity today. He will introduce the speakers and moderate this afternoon's discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For more than a decade now, the seminar series has tried to provide a nonpartisan forum in the nation's capital to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications that shed light on policy-relevant issues in national and global affairs. Prior to the pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center, but we're now very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook, and we're delighted that many more people, in fact, have now a chance to participate in these sessions. Behind the scenes, two individuals help produce this event, Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We want to acknowledge our supporters, and we also thank our two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest and the George Washington University History Department. We welcome all of your support. Donations to our two organizations are tax deductible. So as we're heading into tax season in this country, in the US, here's a great idea on how to lower your taxes. Give to the Washington History Seminar. Information on how to do so is available on our websites and also in the chat function right now. Let me share also with you a bit of sad news. One of our regular participants and frequent supporters, Dr. A. Ross Johnson, passed away this past Saturday, a longtime senior scholar with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, a fervent declassification activist and former director of Radio Free Europe. Ross authored the book Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, the CIA Years and Beyond, published in the Wilson Center series with Stanford University Press in 2010, as well as numerous policy briefs, blogs, and reports on the history of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and contemporary politics of the Balkans. He spoke frequently at Wilson Center panels, organized many events, and as mentioned, was a regular at our sessions with many thoughtful and informed interventions. We will miss him and are grateful for his many generous, kind, and well-informed contributions. Finally, a brief note that today's featured publication, White Freedom, will be available for a 30% discount and free shipping from Princeton University Press through their website through the end of this month. Use the discount code WHS, Washington History Seminar, WHS-FG. The information is also in the chat. A quick note on the meeting logistics here. Today's session will be, as always, recorded and soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of the seminar, please use the raised hand function in the Zoom functionality. If you would like to ask a question, once you press the button, you will be entered into a queue. When the moderator calls on you, please, you will receive a prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please do so. Please press yes. Otherwise, you won't be able to talk. You can start getting in line even before the discussion period. We encourage you to do that as soon as you have a question. You may also submit questions to Rachel Wheatley via the email rwheatley@historians.org. And with that, I'll turn the Zoom room over to Eric. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our author and commentator. Our author, as you know, is Tyler Stovall, formerly Distinguished Professor of History and Dean of Humanities at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and currently Professor of History and Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Fordham University. He is also, I should add, a former president of the American Historical Association. An historian of France, Professor Stovall is the author and editor of many books, including The Rise of the Paris Red Belt from 1990, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, 1996, Paris and the Spirit of 1919, 2012, Transnational France, The Modern History of the Universal Nation, 2015. And today, he will be speaking about his most recent book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, published last month by Princeton University Press. Professor Stovall, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Professor Arneson. Thank you, Mr. Osterman, and all the members of the Washington History Seminar. It is a privilege and an honor to be invited to talk with you today, given all the many momentous things that are going on in our nation's capital. I'm, very impressed and slightly bemused that you would find time to listen to me speak. But I'm very grateful for that. So I just wanted to say a few words then about the book I've written and why I decided it was important to write. And, and then I'll be happy to take questions, first of all, for Professor Alice Conklin, who it's great to see again. And most importantly, for all of you in the audience, I very much am interested in hearing what you have to say, your reactions to the topic, your reactions to the book. So let me just start off by saying this was a book that I never expected to write. Every once in a while, you get these ideas that simply will not leave you alone. And that was the case with this. What intrigued me about this topic was the idea that you have this tremendous contradiction between, on the one hand, societies that have embraced freedom as their seminal central value, and on the other hand, the fact that these same societies have often denied the idea of freedom to many members of those societies in ways that were often based on race. So I wanted to explore how that worked and why you had the juxtaposition of these two seemingly very, very different events. And the thing that really started me thinking in concrete terms about this was an incident that arose about 15, 20 years ago, having to do with the US Capitol building. And I decided to start the book with the introduction discussing that. And I want to read just a page or so from the introduction. So I write, at the dawn of the 21st century, the American Congress appointed a task force to investigate the veracity of a persistent rumor that the US Capitol building, among other official structures in Washington, D.C., had been built by the labor of Black slaves. Rumors to this effect had existed for some time, but recent revelations of receipts for payments for slaves found in the Treasury Department had lent them new credence. Accordingly, Congress created the Slave Labor Task Force in order to investigate the rumors and decide what, if anything, the federal government should do in response to them. In 2005, the task force released its report entitled History of Slave Laborers in the Construction of the United States Capitol, concluding that the rumors were true. And it said, soon after it was finished in the 1820s, the Capitol began to be called the Temple of Liberty because it was dedicated to the cherished idea of freedom, equality, and self-determination. How then can a building steeped in those noble principles have been constructed with the help of slave labor? The first step in the Capitol's evolution was taken in the last decade of the 18th century and was, in fact, assisted by the toil of bondsmen, mainly slaves rented from the local owners to help build the Capitol and the city of Washington. So the report's conclusion led Congress to take several actions to rectify the historical record and acknowledge the role played by African slaves in building the Capitol. Unlike most congressional activities at the time, and I would add since, they represented a bipartisan effort, reaffirming the accord of both Democrats and Republicans. In 2007, Congress agreed to rename the Great Hall of the Capitol Visitors Center Emancipation Hall in honor of the slaves who helped build it. As Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. argued, emancipation is the great enduring theme of our nation's still unfolding history. Without emancipation, our house divided would not have stood. We would not be a beacon of freedom and democracy around the world. We would never have had, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, quote, a new birth of freedom. Both the House and the Senate overwhelmingly approved the measure in November 2007, and President George W. Bush signed it into law the following January. 2 years later, on June 16, 2010, congressional leaders from both parties unveiled 2 plaques in Emancipation Hall that honor the work of enslaved African Americans in building the Capitol. The story of Emancipation Hall in many ways tells an inspiring and moving story of a nation's willingness to come to terms across party lines with its slave heritage. But it also raises some interesting and ultimately rather unsettling questions. Why would one name a building constructed by slaves Emancipation Hall as a way of honoring their legacy and history? They certainly were not emancipated when they worked there. Freedom undoubtedly represented the aspiration of those whose forced labor built the Capitol and so much of America, but it was definitely not their reality and did not express the nature of their lives. Probably very few of them lived to see the end of slavery. How could naming a structure they built emancipation illustrate the nature of lives lived without freedom? If one really wanted to acknowledge them, why not call the building Slave Hall? Why would it be impossible to imagine an official government building in a country that claimed freedom as its greatest value with that name? Did the name Emancipation Hall, far from honoring the slaves who helped build it, instead represent yet another denial of their own history? If so, why did all of official Washington, including African American legislators descended from slaves, rush to embrace it? So that is how I open the book, and I open it with the question of how do we understand this history? How do we deal with the idea that so much of America and so much of France, the other nation I focus on in particular, so much of their history was shaped by unfreedom, yet at the same time, these are 2 nations that have adopted freedom as their central value. I chose to focus on France and the United States, partly because I am trained as a French historian, I am an American by citizenship and nationality, but more importantly, because these are probably the 2 nations in the world that are most enamored of making the idea of freedom central, not only to their politics, but their national identities. Both France and the United States see being free, the idea of freedom, as lying at the core of what it means to be French and what it means to be American. And yet both have at the same time tremendous associations with different stages of unfreedom. When the French revolutionaries proclaimed liberté, égalité, fraternité, they were also controlling the greatest slave economy in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, that in some ways the world had ever seen. Similar with the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in a nation that was almost 1/5 slave. So in trying to answer this problem, this of course is something that many historians have grappled with over many years, if not decades, if not centuries. What I decided was that I did not like the idea that there was a contradiction between the emphasis on freedom and the belief in racism and the practice of racial discrimination. Rather, I looked at ways in which they had something in common. What was it that brought them together, that unified them into a common practice? Because it seems to be something that is so deeply contradictory, it's hard to imagine why it would last for literally hundreds of years without ultimately breaking down. So there had to be some sort of underlying unity between these 2 concepts. And what I found was it was simply a matter of race, that freedom could coexist with racism as long as freedom was defined as white freedom, as long as it was defined as something that belonged to white people, or to put it, in one sentence, to be free was to be white was to be free. And so what I looked at was the ways in which not just people who are of color, non-whites, were seen as not free, but also the ways in which the definition of white people very much included the idea of being free. And in doing so, I was guided to a large extent by whiteness scholars who have emphasized the idea that whiteness is not just a sort of a static quality. It's not just something that exists, but rather that whiteness is constructed, that white identity is constructed. And I wanted to explore the ways in which belief in freedom as an identity was part and parcel of that construction of whiteness in France and the United States. And then I also wanted to look at the ways in which people who are not white were therefore ipso facto seen as not only not free, but not having the right to be free and not being capable of freedom. And then finally, I wanted to explore the fact that white freedom is not the entire story of freedom. There have been many different peoples around the world of all sorts of races and colors that have demanded freedom as their ultimate birthright, that have been willing to give their lives to fight and die for freedom. So in contrast to this idea of white freedom, I also wanted to set the idea of a more universal, a more inclusive idea of freedom, and explore the ways in which many peoples have fought for that and intrinsically against white freedom. So for example, if you look at the history of the civil rights movement, if you look at books written about the civil rights movement, so many of them have the word freedom in the title. So for many African Americans, freedom is starting with John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom as a classic example. So for many African Americans and many other peoples of color in the United States and throughout the world, freedom exemplified what they saw as their right, what they were striving for. But in order to achieve that, they had to fight against a different idea of freedom that reserved freedom for whites. So that is the central sort of argument of the book. And I look at it from a variety of different perspectives. The book is basically divided into 3 sections of 2 chapters each. The second 2 sections, the second and third sections are chronological, going roughly from the Enlightenment down to the end of the Cold War, pretty much down to the present day. And in 4 chapters, I explore the history of white freedom from the era of Atlantic revolutions in the 18th and early 19th centuries, then moving into the 19th century, then the era of the world wars, and then finally the post-war era after 1945. By contrast, the first 2 chapters are more thematic. The first chapter looks at the idea that freedom is not necessarily a positive idea, that there are very many negative associations of freedom. All one has to do is think of the words like license, for example, or libertine, or anarchism, to come up with concepts of freedom that are seen as negative. And I wanted to explore in this chapter how these negative concepts of freedom, what I call savage freedom, are domesticated and ultimately overthrown to make way for white freedom that is part and parcel of liberal capitalist society. So the first chapter looks at 2 rather contrasting groups. It looks at pirates on the one hand as symbols of a kind of freedom that has to be destroyed. And it also looks at children. Children are seen as, in many ways, free beings, but they have to mature and in some ways lose that kind of freedom in order to become parts of mature society. So call this the Peter Pan chapter, because in both cases, you have groups that whose sense of freedom is very, very rooted in our society, and yet has to be destroyed in one way or another for white freedom to take place. And then the second chapter looks at what I call the greatest symbol of freedom and of white freedom in the world, the Statue of Liberty. And it looks at how both through its origins in France and through its establishment in the United States, the Statue of Liberty reflected ideas of freedom that were in many ways racialized white. So everything from its European cast to its association with white immigration into the United States, or immigration that was gradually perceived as white immigration into the United States. And also to the fact that even though the French had initially intended the Statue of Liberty to signal the abolition of slavery in the United States, the fact that America was finally a land of the free, that meaning was lost or suppressed in the American use of the Statue of Liberty. So to this day, most Americans really don't know about that association. And it struck me that deeply ironic that America's greatest symbol of liberty, in fact, the world's greatest symbol of liberty, should literally turn its back to what is probably the greatest freedom struggle in American history, that against slavery, because that was not a matter for white freedom. So those are the basic outlines of the book, and that is what I've tried to achieve. I tried to show that freedom, like many other ideas, has many different aspects to it. And the role of race and racial discrimination in Western society is so profound that even a noble idea like freedom has been shaped by race and racial thinking. So.
Thank you very much, Tyler. I'll now introduce our discussant, Alice Conklin, who is the Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of History at Ohio State University. A cultural, political, and intellectual historian of modern France and its empire, she is the author of In the Museum of Man, Race, Anthropology, and Empire in France, 1850 to 1950, published by Cornell in 2013, a book that won the David H. Pinckney Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies and the Senior Book Prize from the Ohio Academy of History, and the author of A Mission to Civilize, the Republican Idea of Empire in France and West Africa, 1895 to 1930, published by Stanford University Press in 1997, which won the Berkshire Prize for Best Book by a Woman, among other works. Her articles have appeared in the American Historical Review, French Historical Studies, and a number of other journals, and her current project is a transnational history of French anti-racism between 1945 and 1965. Professor Conklin, Zoom room is yours.
Thank you. I'd like also to thank the moderators for inviting me to comment on Tyler's book. It's a true pleasure to be able to reflect a little bit on white freedom, the racial history of an idea. I feel it's particularly, obviously it's a very timely book, but Tyler, you started your career at OSU as a modern French historian. I feel like I'm going to be ending my career at OSU, so we've got a tie there too. So, though you've changed coasts again, I see your very peripatetic career.
Well, so, what you don't know is I'm also a Columbus native. So my roots at Ohio State go back way back.
I thought you were born in Gallipolis, Ohio.
I was in Gallipolis, but I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. So yes.
Yeah. So we're all about Ohio today. White freedom is first and foremost a reminder of the racist legacy behind a certain Western idea of freedom, a legacy that Tyler chronicles from the Enlightenment to the present in lively and accessible prose. This wonderful book is two things at once. First and foremost, it boldly synthesizes decades of scholarship on the separate freedom struggles of white people and people of color, from the era of the Atlantic revolutions through the total race wars of the 20th century and their aftermath. Research, some of which Tyler just shared with you, and which I will certainly not be doing justice to. So Tyler's deep knowledge of the history of modern France, first as a labor historian, then as a pioneering historian of the African-American diaspora in France, and more recently as a scholar of race in France and the Francophone world, all of this shines through, but he has also moved in a more expansive direction in this book compared to all of his earlier work. And by expansive, I mean in a more global and comparative direction. This really is a book about the West, in which the United States figures centrally, France too, but the British Empire, the Nazi regime, the rise and fall of the Soviets, colonialism, and decolonization are also covered. If I had to summarize the book's emphases, I would say that it focuses primarily on the entangled histories of race and freedom in the United States on the one hand, and those same entangled histories of race and freedom in Europe and their empires on the other. Tyler's thesis is straightforward and powerful. White freedom is a study of two seminal values in the modern world, freedom and race, and the relationship between them. For a long time, these two values were studied separately, as if they were antithetical and thus unrelated. Indeed, in the case of scholarship on modern Europe, while studies of freedom struggles proliferated, studies of race have tended to focus more narrowly on the extermination of European Jewry, with little reference until recently, and I really underline until recently, to earlier European involvement in the slave trade, because that field has just taken off now in the French context. It was, not surprisingly, historians of the early American Republic who first struggled to conceptualize how a war for liberty also preserved and reinforced slavery. For these historians, the relationship between race and freedom was, as Tyler pointed out, a paradoxical one that, he asserts, was and remains the wrong way to approach this topic. White freedom maintains that for much of the history of the West, the struggle for freedom was racialized, and that contemporaries who were on the winning side of history, mainly white people, saw no contradiction between founding new republics in the name of the ideal of universal freedom, and at the same time limiting that freedom to themselves. White privilege is literally baked into the DNA of Western modernity, and at its most extreme, freedom can be and historically has been a racist ideology. Now, I cite this sentence, and it's one of Tyler's sentences, can be and historically has been a racist ideology, because I know Tyler chose his words carefully. He certainly is not saying, and he said this, that freedom has to be a racist ideology. And the book has sections, in my mind, some of the most powerful ones, on Black freedom struggles that historically sought to wrest the freedom concept from its narrow and white interpretation, render it more inclusive. But what Tyler is offering us is a compelling tableau of how historians still working in their national silos could and should work harder to challenge traditions of liberty grounded in whiteness. We all need to unpack the role that race played in creating and maintaining those traditions down to the present. We all need to pay attention to the fact that in the last 200 years in republics such as the French and American ones, which have liberty as one of their most cherished ideals, the whiter one was, the more free one was. Predominant belief was that freedom was essential to white identity and that only white people can or should be free. So beyond comparative and global, what is the best way to describe this book? Is it an intellectual history of a belief of white superiority, a political history of the politics of whiteness, a history of white blind spots when it came to class, gender, and race-based particularity of their universalist values and claims? Well, I think it's all of these things at once, which is remarkable. But what the book does particularly well is narrate together developments on both sides of the Northern Atlantic in ways that are often not brought together in a single frame. Tyler keeps the two notions of race and liberty front and center as he first tracks the parallel histories of, on the one hand, the gradual institution of mass democracies in the US and Europe in the 19th century, and on the other hand, the simultaneous reinforcement of white freedom in post-Reconstruction America and in Europe's expanding overseas empire. The major events of the 20th century are next told with the same verve and focus on how racialized ideas of freedom continued to reinvent and reassert themselves, even as the Great War against fascism temporarily undercut them. Throughout, Tyler retains a certain optimism, recovering this overlooked racialized dimension of freedom. Learning its history, teaching this history will help us to understand how we can make all the world's people more free. Needless to say, Tyler is preaching to the choir here, at least for me. The time left to me, I would like to pose a few questions that arise from my own comparative work on the history of racism. And these questions fall in three broad categories. So the first is about similarity and difference. I would suggest, Tyler, that you emphasize certain similarities in this book, a common Western experience of limiting full freedom to white people. So here I want to ask, what is sacrificed? when you write the history of 19th century European and French history through the twin lens of freedom and race in ways that downplay the differences between the US and France. As a slave republic that was originally a settler colony, a new nation founded on immigration that was constantly renewed, and a country that went through a civil war and failed radical reconstruction, the United States in the 19th century seemingly could not escape the race question. When Ohio became a state in 1803, it was the first to write in its constitution that only white males could vote, a privilege which only ended legally in 1870. People of color were not overseas, but overwhelmingly shared the same national soil with white Americans, although the majority of African Americans were concentrated in the South, where Northerners increasingly ignored them after the Depression of 1873 hit. Does France's violent expansion in Algeria in 1830, then the creation of what David Todd has recently called the Velvet Empire at mid-century, and finally the era of new imperialism, make race as central to the history of freedom in France as in the US? Or is your main point in bringing these two different national histories into the same frame to push historians to begin to write the particular history of race in Europe, something that still hasn't been done for the 19th century and arguably much of the 20th? For a long time, it's been very easy to say that because Europe didn't practice slavery on its own soil, it didn't have a race problem comparable to that of the US. What I particularly like about your book is that you sidestep that excuse by pointing out that all Western nations have emphasized the link between liberty and race, albeit each in their own way. A second set of questions really has to do with, well, you've told us how you came to write the book, but who you wrote the book for. Do you think most academic historians working on modern Europe and the modern US need to be convinced of your arguments? Would you agree that to write particular histories of race along national lines, historians of, say, France need to know the history of the American Civil War and its aftermath? And US historians need to think comparatively and globally when they write about these events? Or am I barking up the wrong tree? Is this a book written to reach, say, undergraduates, the broader public, who are still being taught a different history about the place of freedom in the history of the West? And that's why I love your opening anecdote. Do you have a contract? This is a really interesting question, for a translation into French or any other European language. It seems this is a book that is ripe for translation. It's been very exciting in the last 10 years to see how much more French scholars and activists are beginning to address the history of slavery, of colonialism and structural racism in France itself, where once they shunned talking about race in France, always pointing the finger at the US, engaged scholars, if not yet politicians, are themselves making the points that you are making, Tyler, that race has functioned in freedom-loving France in ways analogous to its history in the US of A. Final question comes really from a recent experience I had teaching a graduate seminar on the history of the idea of race in Europe. Although I'd included several readings devoted to how peoples of color had resisted notions of white freedom, my course readings were mostly tracking how such a slippery, constantly shifting notion as the idea, the category, the word race was reinvented, remobilized politically by white elites, both liberal and fascists, over and over. But I could tell that after a while that students, what they really wanted most to read were the accounts of those individuals of color who were excluded from white freedom, yet nevertheless managed to navigate the racist formations that framed their lives and to survive them. My students, several of whom were European themselves, seemed to see the long history of white privilege as a permanent given in the West, whether it's the product of the anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church, the trade in commodified human beings, or liberal racist scientists. Not to simplify, but they were already won over to the idea that the Nazi racial nation state was an extreme example of a continuum of racial states that existed before and since the Holocaust. What really needed to be recovered were the voices of the marginalized. Yet, like you, I persist in thinking that the history of white freedom is one that is less familiar to scholars than the history of struggles against it. And if anything, writing the history of whiteness helps to show what those who fought it were up against. And I think that's a quote from you too. So I'm curious, I know you've been doing a lot of administering and not teaching so much, but whether you've encountered anything like this, a kind of resistance to making white people so much as part of the story of race and freedom. Anyway, that's really the gist of that question. So to wind up, and once again to quote Tyler, the history of the idea of freedom is a complicated one. Although you are at pains at the outset to insist that there was no paradox in the juxtaposition of white freedom and Black slavery in the minds of whites at the founding of our nation, your own analysis is replete with the language of paradox and contradictions. We can't get outside of that word. What did not appear as a contradiction in the context of racialized ideas of freedom in the 18th century by the end of World War II was fully evident even to white elites. They couldn't both fight against Nazi bigotry and for racially segregated societies at home and overseas. So as a result, racism was officially condemned in the West after the war, although arguably this was more due to civil rights activists and anti-colonial movements than liberals fully grasping their own inconsistencies. So Tyler, you end with what we all know to be true since the 1950s. Dominant political ideologies globally have regularly proclaimed the importance of both racial equality and human freedom. But here again, I quote, "But white identity and white privilege nonetheless remain significant determinants of the ability to be free." Explaining why that should still be true is the task awaiting historians, whatever path to that end they choose to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Tyler, it's yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Alice, for those wonderful and very thought-provoking questions. And rather than just sort of go down the list, I'm going to do a sort of scattershot approach. And I'm going to start with one of the last points you made, which is about the whole study of, because this is something that anybody who studies whiteness or who studies masculinity, for example, deals with. Why are you studying the dominant? And is studying and focusing on the histories of the dominant, in effect, reproducing that kind of dominance, right? And in fact, rather than looking at the struggles that people who were oppressed by the dominance have had to engender. So I think, yeah, it's a very viable question. It's a very viable criticism. But I do think that it is nonetheless important to do so, just because I don't think we can really understand the nature of oppressive systems without understanding what motivates the people that practice them, right? And so I think that ultimately what we want to strive for is an interactive kind of history that looks at both, systems in ways that, explore how people that achieved dominance, how they did so, but also how people that fought against the idea did so as well. And I would also say that one of the interesting things about this topic is it really does look into the ways in which peoples achieved whiteness. I mean, for example, I thought the history of the Irish, for example, in the 19th century and up to the early 20th century is really fascinating, because here is a group that in many ways is very much seen as racialized Black or racialized, certainly non-white, in the early 19th century in Britain. And over time, that changes, not completely, but it does change, both in Britain and the United States. So, but no, thank you for that question. You asked about my strategy of looking at similarities between, say, the United States and France, and what does that sort of hide in terms of differences between those two countries? And let me just say a few words about that, because it's a very important question. In an earlier sort of iteration, before I got into this topic particularly, but I remember at one point talking about history of slavery in France and in the United States, and making the point that both France and the United States were slave nations, but France, unlike the United States, was never a slave republic. So that's the other thing about that really brings these the histories of these two nations together. Both are preeminent examples of Republican ideology in modern history. And one of the signal differences between them is that in France, republicanism and slavery never coexisted. When the First Republic abolishes slavery, it's restored by the First Empire. The Second Republic definitively abolishes slavery in 1848. In the United States, on the other hand, and there's this whole debate about, in reaction to the New York Times 1619 Project, about whether or not a key reason for the Declaration of Independence and the movement for independence by the American colonies was to preserve slavery. And that's a whole different debate. But I would emphasize that in some ways, the debate is a bit misplaced, because the basic point is that however it happened, the United States that became independent after 1783 was a slave nation, was a slave republic. And it did find ways of combining those two ideas. The other thing, and I think you sort of mentioned this, was the difference that you get in Europe between the metropole and the colonies, right? In other words, the idea that if slavery is not allowed in the metropole, then you cannot talk about slavery or racism or imperialism as being part of the national heritage, even though that was practiced overseas. And people will point to, for example, both French and British decrees, especially the French decrees abolishing slavery in France. In other words, saying, well, Sue Peabody's work about there are no slaves in France, making that point. I find that argument somewhat problematic, because the bottom line is that the same flag flew over metropolitan France and flew over the French colonies. The same flag flew over the British Empire and the British home islands. And it's sort of like saying that, well, because the North in the United States did not allow slavery, therefore America was not a slave nation. Now, of course, the Dred Scott decision put pay to that argument, because it ultimately established the fact that slavery was permissible throughout the United States, and it was one of the precipitating causes of the Civil War. But I think I think a whole generation now of historians of modern France and historians of the French Empire have really argued against the idea that these two sort of spheres of French life are completely separate. That you have to look at metropole and colony as really coexisting in the same political and cultural sphere, and legal sphere ultimately as well, and that you have to consider them one nation. Let me just say from an aside also, one of the things that really struck me in trying to explore this history in the French case was the whole relationship between republic and empire. Because in theory, at least, of course, what republics do is get rid of empires. They overthrow empires, right? And in the French case, the Second Empire, the last empire in French history, was overthrown by the Third Republic. The problem was the Third Republic then goes on to create the largest empire in French history. So you have a situation where you have a republican government that has no empire, but that has no emperor, but has an empire, right? That has citizens and subjects at the same time. And it just so happens that the citizens are white and the republic and the subjects are overwhelmingly non-white. The one major exception to that is the French Caribbean islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Guyana, where you do have Black citizens. And yet the nature of that citizenship, because they are ruled by colonial government, is very problematic, and in some ways really reinforces this racial distinction between citizen and subject in the French Empire. And then finally, not finally, because you asked a lot of things, but let me emphasize this one. You asked who I wrote the book for. Okay, well, in one way, I wrote it for myself, right? I wrote it because I was trying to answer these questions and I didn't know any other way how to do it than exploring them. But of course, you don't tell a publisher that. So, not if you want to get published. So I think I wrote it for several audiences. I wrote it for, I think, in terms of just level of people, I wrote it for hopefully undergraduates and hopefully my colleagues. I mean, I realized, a lot of this will not be new to many of my colleagues as history professors, but I was very interested in particular in exploring this on a transnational basis, because so many of these concepts are very familiar to historians of the United States, and they are less familiar to historians of France or other European nations. But I also thought, what can American historians learn from the role of race in an empire in modern Europe? What can they learn from the history of the Enlightenment, for example? One of the stories I most enjoyed sort of finding out about and writing this book, and I never knew anything about this, was the story of Mozart's Magic Flute Opera. I never knew that opera was all about the history of a slave revolt, right? And the suppression of a slave revolt by forces of liberalism and enlightenment. Nor did I know that the opera premiered at almost exactly the same time as the outbreak of the revolution in Saint-Domingue, right? So on both sides of the Atlantic, you have this really sort of interesting formulation of freedom and race. Historians are storytellers, after all. I love a good story. And this is one of the stories that really spoke to me. But I would love to see people that are very much enriched in national histories, also looking at the ways in which these ideas are globalized. It was also interesting from that respect, looking at the history of Nazi Germany and the many ways in which historians have looked at it in context, with broader context of race, and not just Nazi Germany, fascist Italy as well, and exploring that, and exploring the, on both sides of the Atlantic during the Second World War, how race worked. And what other story I enjoyed was because I'm a historian of 1919 also, it's my favorite year, the story of Woodrow Wilson and how his own, people have talked about how Woodrow Wilson's racism made a difference in domestic politics, but I wanted to explore its relationship to global politics and to global ideas of democracy. So, the Peace of Paris, the negotiations that he is helping to lead in 1918, 1919, really do help create this world where you have, on the one hand, white independent states. It is a process that gives independence, and at least briefly democracy, to all of the European states of Eastern Europe, new states of Eastern Europe that had been created as a result of the collapse of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian and German empires, but at the same time preserves colonialism and empire in the non-white countries of Africa and Asia. So it is a real statement of white freedom on a global sense. It partly comes out of perhaps his own background, his own racial and racist background, but also comes out of a broader context at the time. So anyway, these are the kinds of stories I like to read, and I'd like to write for others. And I hope finally that people that like a good story will like this book.
They will.
All right. Now we are going to, in a moment, open this up for question and answers. We've got the Q&A function on Zoom. We have the raise hand function that will allow you to speak. You can email Rachel Wheatley with the address that's in the chat function. We already have a number of people queued up, but as the co-chair of the seminar, I'll exercise my prerogative, but I will also exercise my restraint because I have so many questions that I would just love to talk with you about, and we could fill up the rest of the time, but then lots of people would be mad at me. So I won't do that, but I'll ask one or two if I may. And so what struck me reading the book was that the concept of freedom, as you show, has multiple meanings. It could rest on individual liberty, or it could rest on notions of national independence. Same word, different meaning. And the content of race or race thinking also changes considerably over time. And yet the two terms are joined, and they are invested with considerable power. They have a lot of work to do in this book as you move ahead in time. But I kept wondering while reading if this concept, which would apply to Rousseau or Jefferson in one period, Hitler and Mussolini in another, and the revolutions of 1989 toward the end, or the most recent election or previous election in the United States, if that's not a lot of weight to put on a concept. And so I'm wondering what is gained or what is lost by applying something that means different things in different periods of time to the phenomenon that you explained.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. It's by no means the first time I've been posed that question, because it really sort of leaps out at you, I think. Freedom does mean lots of different things to lots of different people. One of the most intriguing ideas, one of the most intriguing things I discovered in writing this book was the whole use of the concept of freedom by fascism. Because what fascism does is basically emphasizes freedom, but gets rid of what most Westerners see as the absolute heart of freedom, the individual, right? And it says, instead, freedom is racial freedom. It is freedom of the state. It is freedom of the individual to submit to the state and to advance the goals of the state, which is racialized. So like you said, going from that to the Statue of Liberty is quite a leap. Is quite a leap. I think there are two things that sort of made me want to hold on to the concept of freedom. The first is simply that precisely because of its unwieldy and really disparate nature, it really is a world historical term. It really does bring together so many different aspects of world history that it has that utility. But the second argument, I think, which was more convincing to me, was that here you have a term that millions of people have fought and died for, that have embraced as the ultimate meaning of their life. And it felt to me somehow not right to take that term away from them, right? To, I mean, there are literally gravestones of soldiers that talk about their fight for freedom, right? And who am I as a historian to deny them that right, to say that they sacrificed everything for this concept? I can nuance it. I can explore the different ways in which it has changed over time. I mean, that is what historians do. But I didn't feel it was quite right or just morally justified ultimately to take that term away from so many people that have fought for a universal idea of freedom, for example.
Thank you. We have a number of hands already up, and I'll take them in order. James Banner is number 1 in the queue. Jim, unmute yourself and introduce yourself before you ask your question.
You have already done so, Eric. I'm James Banner here in Washington and a longtime participant in this seminar. Professor Stovall, it's nice to see you. We've never met. I have this a question for you. I think it's rather limited, but it occurred to me while as we started this seminar and as you began your talk, how far back can you drive the link between freedom and race? How far back in human or Western history? I mean, can that be known? Do you know? Is it known?
Okay, well, let me just say that there's two parts of your question. How far back can one drive this link, and how far back can I drive this link?
Well, that's okay. True, yes. But that's just sure. But I assume they're fairly closely related.
They're fairly close, but let me just emphasize that I'm a historian of modern France and of the modern era more generally. And there's a tradition among historians to say that everything that's interesting just starts right at the point of your expertise, right? And that the period before that is something that is not interesting because you don't know anything about it. I'm saying that to say that most historians I've known have really emphasized the development of both ideas of freedom and ideas of race in the 17th century. But, for example, there's a book that just came out that really looks at freedom by a classical scholar and looks at freedom as a result of the ancient world. And there has also been work on race in the ancient world recently. So my guess is there's a relationship there as well. The role of slavery in ancient Greece, for example, and in ancient Rome, and the ways to which it was or was not racialized, I think. So I think it's possible to take it back a long way, a lot farther than my area of expertise. But I think it's also true that if you do that, you'll probably come up with very different perspectives, which is, of course, what we hope to do.
Thank you. Glenna Matthews has a hand up. Please unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a historian of the U.S. and I've known Tyler for a good many years now.
Yes.
So
hello, Glenna.
It's great to see you. I was thinking, as you were talking, Tyler, about a couple of books in my field that I think, I haven't read your book, so I don't know whether you draw on them, but one is Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, in which Morgan presents the argument essentially that American freedom for white people rests on the unfreedom of Black people as they are being enslaved in the 17th century. And then the other book is The Black Image and the White Mind by George Fredrickson, in which he argues that Herrenfolk democracy, you know, that freedom is defined in this, how should I put it, that as racial ideas about, you know, white supremacy advance, then there's this idea that democracy for the people being white, can advance. And I wanted to bring this up because I have had conversations, not so much with fellow historians, but in the post-George Floyd world, I've had so many Zoom conversations with non-historians who are just not familiar with these ideas at all. And I'm hoping some of those folks are going to read your book.
Okay. Or hopefully they'll read Fredrickson as well, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm familiar with both books. I use their work a lot. You know, one of the things that Morgan's book really introduces, and it's sort of a theme that probably could be explored more on my own, is the role of property and its relationship to the idea of freedom. Both because part of the point about, I mean, you know, I and other historians really talk about the fact that both during the American Revolution and the Civil War, you have slaveholders loudly proclaiming their desire for freedom, right? To a point where it becomes almost a caricature of itself. And yet partly what they're doing is saying freedom rests on their ability to hold property. It just so happened in this case, the property was human beings. But nonetheless, freedom is based on a certain level of physical, of material comfort, of material sort of ease or security, let's put it that way. So I think the role of property is really important. But the idea that there are this, you know, this sort of strange relationship, and Alice is right, I do, in spite of myself, use the word paradox all the time. You just can't get away from it. Is really fascinating. Let me use your question, Glenna, to jump into the present day, or specifically January 6th of this past year, when you had this massive, basically attempt to throw the government by a largely white mob. And like many Americans, I looked at those events and was shocked and horrified, and thought I couldn't believe this was happening in the United States. But it also struck me that, looking at this situation where you have basically a group of white people loudly proclaiming their desires for freedom, their demands for freedom, and not only proclaiming that, but being allowed to invade the Capitol building, one of the holiest of holies of American Republican government, invade it, threaten to murder Congress people, and then walk away without being addressed. And I was like, so tell me that freedom is not white in America, right? And as many people pointed out, if that had been a Black Lives Matter demonstration, the result would probably have been very, very different. So, and what I'm interested in doing is sort of linking up things like that. Believe you me, when I wrote this book, I had no idea something like that was going to happen. But exploring how that also has roots in, for example, the history of the Capitol building itself, being a building in part built by slaves, and the way in which so much of official Washington and official America reflect this idea of white freedom. So, but thanks for that question, Glenna. Yeah, I'm very familiar with this concept. Morgan in particular is absolutely fundamental in terms of my understanding of white freedom.
Thank you. Christian Osterman, my co-chair, has a question for us. Sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Let me also interject here using co-chair's privilege. 3 questions. The first one is, Tyler, I think it's always important that in these historical sessions, in this post-fact era, we talk about our sources. Your book is not an predominantly archival-based study, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sources, and in particular, are there any sources, any texts that stuck out to you? There are many familiar texts and sources that you will have used, but there are some that really spoke to you in terms of your subject that you discovered, in a sense, for for this book? That's the first question. The second question is sort of in the middle of the book at some point, and here I want to sort of draw out the globalizing of this idea of white freedom that's at the heart of your book. You write that the year 1965 seemed to represent a definite death of white freedom on a global scale. I can understand that in a US context, but could you elaborate a little bit on this in a global context? Just to give you a chance to speak to that dimension of your work. And then third, since this event is partly co-sponsored by the Wilson Center, there would have been two questions. One is to talk about Wilson, which you already did. Thank you very much. But the other one is we try to relate history to public policy issues, and I'd like to push you a little bit more beyond just a reference to January 6th to talk about the policy implications, the policy lessons that, you didn't mention policymakers as a particular audience for your book, which I appreciate. But if one of them happened to be interested, why would they want to read this book in terms of their daily focus? Thank you.
Okay. Well, three very diverse questions, and let me do my best with them. First of all, with the question of sources and text. You're right, this is mostly a book that was written using secondary sources, but with some exceptions. And there were issues in which I decided to dive into texts, especially literary texts, more than I had planned, for example. So the first is something I already mentioned. I actually read the entire libretto of The Magic Flute. Right, the first time I've ever done that. I'm not particularly an opera fan, although full confession is in an earlier iteration, I played musical instruments. I actually played in the pit orchestra for the Magic Flute at one point when I was in college. Little did I know, but I was very interested to see a couple things. First of all, how this idea of a slave revolt happened, and also why hadn't anybody ever talked about it before. So I read both the primary, the text itself, but also some of the literature, musicological literature on the Magic Flute. There were also movements that I decided to look at, especially in terms of readings in the modern press, 20th century press. So for example, I devote a couple pages to discussing the history of the Double V campaign in the Second World War. And I looked into it was started by a letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier in the 1940s. And then I traced that through many different newspapers, how African-American newspapers explored this campaign and not just explored, but expanded and did the drumbeat for this campaign to build it up. So, and then finally, one interesting thing I read was horrifying, but I read the entire Mein Kampf, for example, Hitler's text, and was really reading it with an idea towards where did Nazi racism come from, and how did it fit into this broader context of global racism and whiteness. So, so my exploration of sources tended to emphasize more specific sources rather than overarching vision. But I found that they were very useful and oftentimes revealed things that I wouldn't have thought of. You asked the question about 1965. And there was a time when I thought maybe I should have just ended the book at 1965, because first of all, it's the year of the Voting Rights Act, but it's also a year that really in many ways marks the end of decolonization. By 1965, by the late 1960s, for example, Europe, most European imperial states have given up their empires. It's telling that by the late 1960s, the largest imperial power in Europe is Portugal, which is also one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. So that empire has now become a symbol of weakness rather than strength. But it seemed to me that 1965 stood for, in many ways, the sort of triumph of the post-war vision of universal freedom. And yet I chose not to end the book there, because it seems to me that was not the entire story. It seemed to me there was a whole revival of Western control, white freedom, whether it be the rise of what Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism in Africa in particular, And in the United States, the rise of the new right, which took many different forms. One of the things you asked if I could speak to policymakers. Well, one of the policymakers I criticize in the book is actually our greatest policymaker, President Joe Biden, who I criticize for his role in campaigning against busing for school integration in the 1970s and 1980s. So, and that brings me to your third question. If I could speak to policymakers, what would I say to them? And I think I would say that one has to be very careful in looking at how freedom is measured. And if you have policies that are not working for the freedom of all, they're really not about freedom, they're about white freedom, in effect, in American history. And that sort of ties into what I was saying about the January 6th mobilization. I mean, one of the things that was really striking about that was that you had people demanding that their votes be counted because they felt that their votes had been ignored through a conspiracy to elect Joe Biden, completely ignoring the fact that their own party, because they proclaimed themselves Republicans, has been engaged in massive voter suppression for years. And in fact, even since the inauguration, something like 100 bills have been introduced into state legislatures to restrict voting rights across the country. So again, it seems to me what was an issue there was a definition of white freedom, the freedom of whites to vote, and of their votes to be counted, if need be, counted more than those of anybody else. And so I would say to policymakers, this is an example of how the right to vote is a precious right that has to be applied universally, or otherwise it's not freedom at all. It is white privilege.
Thank you. We have a question that's come in over email from Arlene Coven, who writes, you mentioned that there's been some movement away from race in the UK and the US as it relates to the Irish. How did this occur? And do you think that this could be a springboard for change in the United States as it relates to how African Americans are seen?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. It's a big one. And I think I talked about both Britain and the United States. The trajectories are somewhat different. So let me just start with Britain. Over the course of a century, you go from the 19th century, the early 20th century, you go from the Irish being seen as basically the poorest of the poor, the lowest of the low in British society. And I'm talking about Irish immigrants in particular. Let me leave aside for the moment what's happening on the Irish home island. But the Irish immigrants are seen as very impoverished, in effect, people of color in many ways. There's a great book called White Britain and Black Ireland, for example, that explores that relationship. Over time, they managed to integrate themselves to a greater extent, although not fully by any means, into British society. And a lot of this comes through the involvement in the labor movement in Britain. So, for example, the 1889 dock strike in London, Irish organizers are very prominent, as they are in the Chartist movement earlier in the century. And those kinds of activities gradually bring them certainly not full acceptance by any means, but a greater level of status. In the United States, the history is very different. The early 19th century saw immigration into the United States, apart from British immigration, from two main countries, Ireland and Germany. German immigration was relatively easy because the Germans are Protestant. They fit more easily into a Protestant society. Irish immigration was much more difficult. And especially in cities like Boston and New York, communities were very, very hard put to it. One of the things the Irish immigrants drew from this experience, or many of them, not all of them by any means, but was that the way to establish themselves as equals in society was to disassociate themselves from those who were seen as less deserving of respect or less prestigious, and that was African Americans. So the high point of this was the New York City draft riots in the 1860s, where you had, to a certain extent, although not entirely, Irish mobs attacking African Americans and keeping them out of their jobs. So whether or not this would be a model for success of African Americans is a question. I mean, what the sort of idea I derive from this experience is that you can succeed by finding a group that's lower placed than you to base your success on, right? For the most part, African Americans have not been able to do that. And in fact, you could look at the increased differentiation of Black migration to the United States, of Blacks from Africa, for example, from the Caribbean, as opposed to people whose ancestors came to the United States as slaves. An argument that differentiation sort of has many ways underscored the position of African Americans at the bottom of the American totem pole rather than lifting them up. But at the same time, you can look at certain areas where you see, say, for example, the relationship between African Americans and Latinos, where African Americans are sometimes more well placed in society in terms of institutions, in terms of jobs, than our recent Latin American immigrants. What I would like to see, of course, is where you do not have to have groups pitting themselves against each other in order to achieve basic respect and treatment.
Thank you. From the Q&A function, we have a question from Heidi Nichols, who writes, my question concerns the relationship between Professor Stovall's exploration of freedom and what we might think about as a similarly racialized construction of sovereignty amidst empires. For instance, he notes that the chapters discuss savage freedom. From here, I can't help but think of how the framing of freedom, if referring to white freedom in its impact on Native nations and indigenous peoples, might point us to questions of sovereignty.
Okay. Well, that's a wonderful question, and I'll take a stab at it. I don't feel I can fully answer it. Let me just look at the latter part first, the whole emphasis on Native American peoples, because that's, that was a group that I did not address as much as I would like to have done in the chapter on savage freedom, and yet that is also very important. I mean, I mentioned Peter Pan. Well, of course, Peter Pan includes groups that are seen as free. It includes the Lost Boys, it includes pirates, and it also includes Native Americans, right? And all of these are groups of people that have to be either destroyed or civilized. The children grow up to become, as it literally says in the book, grown men with beards and jobs, and the pirates and the Native Americans just fade away. So there is a sense also that, to this day, for example, one of the classic images of freedom in the United States is the Plains Indian riding across an unfettered terrain, riding on horseback, right? So Indians symbolize a kind of freedom, but it's a freedom that has to be suppressed. In terms of sovereignty, I think that's a really interesting point, because sovereignty, of course, represents really state control, the control of the state as a whole over the population and based upon right. And that is in some ways antithetical to freedom, because of course many freedom struggles have been opposed to sovereignty. And yet at the same time, it suggests that individuals are sovereign over themselves, that have powers over their own lives. And that is the ultimate kind of freedom, to be in effect a king in one's own house, so to speak. So it's an idea that, I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's certainly worth exploring.
We have a question from the Q&A from Jessica Bergen, who writes, I am studying the transformation of Louisiana Acadian identity to a Cajun identity and the intersection of a US American empire. The evolution occurred in the late 19th century, but I see a connection between American imperial thinking about race and the development of Acadian identity. I believe armchair ethnographers, travelogue writers, and literary wannabes rendered Acadians as foreign. I believe that Cajun historians, cultural boosters, and self-professed Cajun identity experts created a French fantasy heritage that has more to do with imperial racial thinking than Americanization. So here's the punchline. How do you see American empire playing a part in racial identity making of the late 19th century by whites?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question, because there are a lot of, one of the challenges to American historiography has been to integrate the idea of empire into what it means to be American and what American history is all about. So you could look at it, I think, in several different respects. You could look at the fact that by the end of the 19th century, the American colonies are mostly colonies that are inhabited by populations of color. You could look at, for example, the Spanish-American War, for example, and the impact on the Caribbean, which was begun with an intention of freeing the peoples of the Spanish Caribbean and ended up buying them to American control. The whole history of Cuba in that story. There's also been interesting work done on African-American soldiers in the Cuban and Philippine wars during the Spanish-American War. So I think it definitely does have an impact. I think it's also a way in which the America's overseas empire. Let me distinguish that from the imperial expansion of the continental West. America's overseas empire happens after the creation of the mastery of the American continent, and it is in a way of projecting American power, and therefore a white vision of power overseas. Now, it's interesting to explore the extent to which this also was embracing a civilizing mission, as was the case in France and Britain. I don't know enough about the history to really be able to speak to that, but it does project American power as a white nation, I think, overseas. And the fact that it is relatively limited compared to that of great European nations, I think in no way takes away from the idea that it is nonetheless shaping the idea of whiteness. Now, it's also true that, and this is true to a certain extent of the British and French empires as well, most British and French people do not see natives in their daily lives in the late 19th century. Most Americans don't either. And yet through stamps, through pictures, through other visual artifacts, they are brought into a knowledge of the idea that their people are dominant worldwide, and that has a racial component.
Thank you. From email, we have a question from Andrew Fogel, or it's kind of a posing of an issue more than a question. Thinking of the paradoxes mentioned in regard to the idea of race and freedom, such as citizen v. subject and free person v. slave, does the relationship between Trump supporters, insurrectionists versus Black Lives Matter advocates function in a similar way through unequal systems of power and the idea of valid grievance to restricted freedom? I mean, whereby white people imagine their loss of freedom, propelled to use politically correct language, wear a mask, etc., while minorities experience actual limits to freedom, voter suppression, police brutality, etc.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. And like I said, historians do not write with mostly with regard to the contemporary story. So it was really strange to me that all this happened. But let me answer it a couple ways. I think you're absolutely right. But I would also say, and this is, Alice talked about how there's a rather strange sense of optimism in the book, to which I plead guilty. One of the things that makes me optimistic, I mean, I remember when the murder of George Floyd happened last summer, and I had a couple of reactions. First of all, I was like, so is this the first time that white people have heard of Black people being killed by the police? Why is there such a big outrage about this one case, right? But it was also an optimistic response, because I felt that, okay, here you have a large percentage of America's population, including its white population, really being outraged by police brutality against Blacks in a way that I hadn't seen before. And that, for me, was a real moment of optimism. And similarly, I think with regard to the reaction to January 6th, this was largely perceived as a racist movement and as a white movement in a way that perhaps it might not have been seen even a few years earlier. The fact that not just Black activists, but many people from throughout the country argued this was beyond the pale in terms of American democracy, and that they saw racism linked to an assault on American democracy, I think was really impressive and important. I mean, I remember a column by the New York Times columnist, Thomas Edsall, right after January 6th, it was labeled White Riot, right? And just laid out very straightforwardly the racial dimensions of this struggle. And as somebody who has seen many Americans struggle to move away from acknowledging racial behaviors and racial patterns of behavior, this came as an important sort of revelation to me, that so many people in America saw this as so outside beyond the pale, excuse the pun here, that the idea of white freedom in general was seen as much more problematic than it had been before. And that gave me grounds for hope.
We have a very short question from an anonymous attendee with no reference to time frame. So I guess that's open for you for answering. How much of the problem is based on skin color or culture? So I guess this gets to issues of sort of the definition of race in any particular historical moment?
Okay. Well, I'm going to adopt the historian's easy out, which is to say both. I mean, both are at play because race is defined by skin color, but it's not just defined by skin color. And of course, there are also gradations within skin colors that are more or less racialized. I mean, there's the whole history of the one-drop rule in the United States. I mean, Washington, D.C. used to have so-called paper bag parties for elite African Americans. And the whole point was that if your skin was darker than a paper bag, you were not admitted into the party. So there were sort of established hierarchies within racial groupings. I think it's hard to really distinguish between them. There are plenty of people, certainly there are plenty of African Americans that are phenotypically white, for example, and yet are seen as African Americans. And there's all sorts of different ways in which race is measured. But I think it is also something that is a matter of identity in both senses, both how you identify and how other people identify you, and the sort of choices that spring for those double senses of identification.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to something you write in the book and something you briefly mentioned in the talk, and that's the Double V campaign that the Pittsburgh Courier launched during the Second World War. Victory over our enemies, fascism abroad, victory over our enemies, racism at home. And I wanted to see if you could tie this to the notion of white freedom, or possibly another term that's a bit more old-fashioned. So I wonder about historical actors. Civil rights activists say, in this case, during World War II, and what they thought they were up against. And I may be mistaken, and you can correct me on this, but as I read the Black press and writings from those contemporaries during the war, they don't conceptualize the problem as white freedom. They conceptualize the problem as, and here's the old-fashioned word, racism. That there is this thing, freedom. It has various attributes. It's supposed to be, they hope, universal, except they are excluded from it by white people, by employers, by unions, by the government, etc. And so they aspire to this thing, freedom, but they're kept out of it because of white supremacy or white racial ideology or racism itself. So the problem isn't freedom. The problem is white people and institutions that are acting on a racist basis. So with that in mind, am I correct in thinking that is how they are expressing and perceiving what they're up against? And why are they wrong?
Okay, I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. People saw that, in effect, there was a problem with the way white people defined freedom, or white people saw freedom, that they didn't understand what it really meant, and that's why they were excluded. Partly, I think it's an absolute, it's an absolute viable argument. I think it's also partly a rhetorical strategy. And let me offer this by way of comparison. I mean, when I was working on African Americans in Paris, for example, I decided that one of the reasons that African Americans really adopted the idea that the French were colorblind was not because it was literally true, but rather because France was a culture that had great prestige in the eyes of white Americans. And it was a way of arguing that these people that you look up to all think we're great. So what does that say about you, right? It was a kind of rhetorical strategy. And I think something similar is going on with what you're talking about. What they reject or they don't see is that the whole idea of whiteness is baked into the idea of freedom. And that's what I'm arguing. And that is, I think, a fundamental difference in viewpoint. But certainly the idea that, all they have to do is look at all so many fundamental texts in American life to say that, yes, all these say that everybody should be free. What they don't say, of course, is why that didn't happen and why freedom had developed in the context of a lack of freedom for people of color. And I think that's sort of the distinction I'm trying to get at.
Thank you. Alice, I see you have a question. If you could unmute yourself.
Okay, no, I wanted to piggyback on that just briefly and sort of circle back to the optimism, point that you were making, Tyler, because I mean, in some ways, yeah, January 6th, it just seems to me will give your book a great boost. Are people, I mean,
I had nothing to do with it.
No, I know, but people are willing to kind of maybe confront the contradiction you lay out in that opening, the opening pages so carefully. At least, I'm thinking about white Americans. I'm not sure that that to me is one audience, because I can see it in my students too, just sort of trying to figure this out. How does this work? Race, we might call it racism, but I like white freedom because I think or white privilege, what does it mean to be a majority, person, and, the privileges that go along with that you don't even see or notice. So I feel optimistic in America. I'm curious whether you feel the same optimism for Europe. I mean, whether you talk almost overwhelmingly about the situation in America, and whether you, I still think the book is structured around a logic that American experience, I mean, the criticism that American history of race is, being applied to Europe in a completely inappropriate way, that's the stock response, rather than, oh, yeah, we have a problem here too. So I'm just curious whether you think, I mean, what I take hope is how many scholars and activists now want to read everything about race in America, among certain French groups, rather than reject it. So I'm just curious if you share that optimism.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. That's a really good one, because the experience in Western Europe and countries like Britain, France, Germany is in many ways, as you said earlier, very different from that in the United States. And certainly I've also been sort of accused of trying to import American ideas or the American experience into a very different historical framework. But there are a couple of ways in which I do have optimism about what is happening in Europe. One, as you said, there are now groups that really emphasize talking about race in France. And France is, I pick on France not just because I know the country, but in many ways it has been the most resistant to this idea of public discussions of race and racial difference. There's the death of George Floyd saw massive protests in Paris, for example, that really didn't just say, oh, the Americans are terrible racists. They also talked about similar cases in France itself and how the French people should address these kinds of issues. And so I think that there are, especially among younger generations, there are people that are willing to take this much more seriously. Now, it depends on the politics of different countries. Germany, France, Britain, Poland, they're all different. But I do think there are these constituencies that do want to explore these questions and do want to make a difference. And that's a good thing.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it is time to draw this to a close. I think we could probably stay on and talk for quite some time to come, but we can't. So I want to thank Tyler Stovall and Alice Conklin for joining us this afternoon, and thank the various folks who are attending and who have asked questions. We appreciate it, and I'm going to turn this back to you, Christian, for final words.
Sure, thanks, Eric. Let me remind our audience that we will meet again next week on Wednesday, February 17th, since the 15th is a federal holiday, when we will have a panel discussion of Juliana Chamedis' new book, A 20th Century Crusade, the Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe. Thanks again to Tyler, Alice, Eric, for a really terrific conversation. Thanks to all of you in the audience for watching, participating. We're adjourned. Stay safe and good night.